Welcome all the viewers on YouTube to the JNS studios here in Jerusalem. My name's Alex Traiman. I'm the CEO of Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org. Check out JNS.org for all the news you need on Israel and Jewish concerns in the United States and elsewhere. We're very excited to be in the studio today with Jeff Ballabon. Jeff Ballabon, you are the Senior Counsel for International and Government Affairs at the American Center for Law and Justice. You're a Yale Law School graduate. You were former senior vice president at CBS News. You also served as Republican counsel to the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee and Legislative Counsel to Senator John Danforth from Missouri. You have been working with coordinating counsel in Jerusalem and numerous other American victims of Palestinian terror who you represented before the White House, State Department, Justice Department, Congress. You worked in the Ministry of Justice here in Jerusalem a long time ago. And you are also involved in a lot of the anti-BDS laws that are taking place, that are being implemented across the United States. But you spent a lot of time here in Israel. And we're in the middle of a war. You feel special bonds to the state of Israel, even though a lot of the work that you do is in the U.S., and Washington, other places. You know, what is it about being here in Israel, especially during this time, that you feel a special connection to?
Thanks, Alex. First of all, it's great to be here with you. I'm a big fan of JNS, fan of yours personally. And so the ACLJ, American Center for Law and Justice, a few years ago, in the middle of COVID, I've been working with them for quite a while, asked if I would consider coming to head their Jerusalem operation, their Israel office. And what's interesting about that is that ACLJ is actually a global organization. Mm-hmm. It's headquartered at the American Center for Law and Justice, primarily the United States. But we have the European Center for Law and Justice in Strasbourg. And we have, at various times, I've had in the former Soviet Union, we've had in South America. So it's really a global organization that is about human rights and freedoms, very much the American constitutional idea of individual rights, individual liberties. But unique to all of its offices, this is not the European Center for Law and Justice, right? This is not the Israel Center for Law and Justice. This is the American Center for Law and Justice Jerusalem office, because their idea is that there's a set of values that include supporting Israel and standing with Israel and what's commonly known as Judeo-Christian values that really are one, and that the idea is to have an office here expressing those values here, showing support here, and also explaining to the millions of followers and supporters of ACLJ in the United States, who primarily are Christians. It's mostly a Christian organization, founded by Pat Robertson, actually, that their continued support for the state of Israel and the Jewish people. And just as an example, this American Center for Law and Justice not only currently represents victims of hostages, their families, or hostage victim families, in negotiations around the world and in Washington, but we have represented the interests of the state of Israel at the ICC in the past, or at the ICJ. And so this is an organization that really sees the idea of a united sort of American exceptionalism meets Israel's uniqueness, and that is the model for goodness in the world. And they asked me if I would come here for them, and I jumped at the opportunity because, yes, I do love being in Israel. I'm always heartsick when and homesick when I'm not in Israel. And even though I'm an American and not an Israeli, now you asked more than ever before. It's always been to me, this is my homeland. These are my holy places, my holy sites. The incredible feeling of unity and privilege and pride that I see among the Jewish people here in the state of Israel is something I've never seen anywhere in my life before. And it's not just that it breeds some sense of hope and optimism in a very, very dark time. It's that I see this as a model for a successful society that doesn't exist anywhere in the world. If America today had a fraction of the patriotism and the love of country that Israelis are now showing, and the unity, I think America would be on a completely different trajectory. It would save America, frankly, from what it's been doing lately, which is circling the drain.
So you're basically saying that Americans have a lot to learn, even from Israelis, and yet Israel's struggling to communicate its purpose as a nation, and also its purpose and its mission in this war to Americans. And quite the opposite. We're even seeing the outgrowth of a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism, both soft forms of anti-Semitism and even now violent forms of anti-Semitism. And you're basically suggesting exactly the opposite, that if Americans would look at the common Israeli, not necessarily the leadership or the IDF or whatever it is, but that actually Israel has a lot to offer the United States just in its own sense of nationalism, pride, and purpose.
100%. And, you said not that the leadership of the IDF. The truth is, among American conservatives, and I clearly fall right in that conservative spectrum in my own personal beliefs, there's a very common saying. It's a bumper sticker you'll see all over the country. I love my country. It's my government I hate, or my government I fear. And for decades, I've thought Israel needs some variant of that, because you see that the people of Israel have this shared identity that I believe it comes from. We've never seen this in 2,000 years. This is Jews. This is not about being religious or observant. It's not about legislating by the government. Just Jews growing up in a majoritarian Jewish culture creates an environment that we haven't seen since the Churban, since the destruction of the temple. And it's not just that these Israelis here today, it's they and almost all of their parents have been raised in an environment of a Jewish majority. And it's something I see as beautiful. And it is manifesting in a growth of observance. And in this war in particular, there's been a trend that I'm sure you've seen. It's very famous. And I think it's beautiful. I mentioned this to a friend of mine recently, that, one of these many videos of soldiers saying, I don't believe in God, but I'm keeping Shabbat because I want to be, or I'm wearing tzitzit. And so he said, well, as we say, it's not for the right purpose, meaning that he said, I'm not a believer.
Right.
But it'll come, it's the opposite. Joining with Jewish unity, that's the highest purpose.
Well, we are seeing certainly is that soldiers, and this is a civilian army for the most part in Israel, all the reservists called Miluimnikim here, they're all leaving their families, leaving their jobs, and they're running to the fire.
Yeah.
And we've known that Israelis are always the first ones, to run towards a situation, but it's hard to imagine in the United States or elsewhere, so many people would just pick up from their private lives and stop what they're doing in order to put their lives on the line, risk everything to save or protect the country.
I think maybe in the founding of the nation, we saw that. And we're seeing it here, and that's another reality. Obviously, in my youth, I attended a Hesder yeshiva here briefly, right?
Right. It's a learning institution where you also serve in the army. You go back and forth,
right,
learning and serving. Yeah.
And it's a beautiful model. It's a beautiful model, and it's a 5-year service instead of 3, because it's part of it is sitting and studying the Torah, and part of it is serving. And so I'm always aware, obviously, of the fact that most Israelis have spent some time in the army, and most Israelis have spent additional time after the army. But now it's like everyone's on call all the time. And a waitress at a restaurant said to me recently, I'm 24 and this is my 4th war. She didn't mean this is the 4th war she's lived through. It means this is the 4th war that she's been in combat. More than, there are American veterans who've been in for 20 years who haven't seen this much combat.
Right.
And yet the spirit is not one of depression. It's one of absolute commitment and pride and love.
Well, it's kind of like the parent, that they love the child more because they invest so much into it, right? So when you put your life on the line, you better love it, you better care about it. But you're saying that there's a big difference here in the pride that Israelis feel, maybe because we've been bounced around the entire world so much, and we know that we've got nowhere else to go. This is it. This is the last stand for this is our Alamo, so to speak. And Americans haven't had that experience because they're not surrounded by enemies, and America's a strong country. They haven't been they haven't been tested by brutal enemies yet, so they haven't had these types of experiences, and perhaps they're not have so much stake in the future.
I'd say that at this moment in American history, the closest analog, and it is still light years away, would be people stuck in border towns, watching their communities being overrun. And that's still a million miles away, because it's not the same as being surrounded by, multiples of your numbers who are dedicated to wiping you out and doing so in the most gruesome way and celebrating it. But those people know what it's like to be under siege. Israel is under siege, but you live here, I'm spending half my time here. That's not the overwhelming sense in the streets, right? It's still, it is listen, it is a beautiful sense, again, of purpose and unity and oneness. And the thing is, the media, again, you mentioned my background, that I've been in media, I've been in the highest levels of media in America. And it's the images that are portrayed about Israel, even then and to this day, do not reflect remotely the actual existence of Israelis day to day. The reasons, and one thing I see, which I think Israelis, you mentioned about helping their messaging, Jews generally, in America too, but Israelis, because they're Jews, have I think make a mistake constantly of projecting the sense of goodness and humanitarianism on audiences that don't necessarily share those exact impulses. Mm-hmm. And so they expect to be taken in good faith, but people are being way too cynical about it. So the portrayal of the situation here is the polar opposite of the actual situation here. That's
really interesting. You see, I also had a similar experience. I was in America, and I spoke recently to a number of American Jews that are sort of deathly afraid about what's going to be in the future of Israel in the short term. And you don't feel that on the streets of Israel, even though most Israelis will accurately express that this is a very difficult time in our country, but you still get the sense from most Israelis that we don't think we're going to get wiped off the face of the map. Right. And there's a sense of hope and optimism for the future, even if this current moment doesn't look so promising.
Well, but I will say that hope and optimism might be a little misplaced. I think that I was asked in an interview, well, Israel always does the right thing, meaning it will defend itself. It's like, well, Israel frequently pulls its punches because it keeps on imagining a decent world, and it needs to imagine an indecent world, which is why the State of Israel ended up being created. And the truth is that for decades, we've seen this coming, and there's been complete denial about it, which is, I was in Washington working on Capitol Hill during Oslo. And so I knew some of the negotiators. Some of them were religious, and they needed help making prayer quorum in the morning. So we'd help them at the Mayflower Hotel. And then for the weekends on Shabbat, they'd come visit us. So we knew them well. And I remember asking them about the likelihood of peace from such a process, because they were just beginning to negotiate with Palestine. Until that point, the rule was very simple. We don't negotiate with terrorists. And maybe there have been side negotiations quietly about hostages, but the notion of negotiating sovereignty for a terrorist organization was complete anathema. And they said, no, it's an absurdity. We're doing this because the West is pressuring us, but the other side, they want one thing. They want our eradication. We will do our best efforts, and maybe the world will see. It's like, no, the world will not see that.
Right.
This has been growing since then, in my estimation. The idea that this created the illusion that there is somehow this other indigenous population that somehow is entitled to a state. No, there never was, and no, there isn't.
Well, I think we're definitely seeing how we're paying now for major national mistakes that we made, which all, fall along that similar theme of negotiating with terrorists. The Oslo Accords, which, paved the pathway toward a Palestinian state that Israelis now realize, well, that was a huge mistake, but they can't figure out how to get out of it. The pullout from Gush Katif in 2005, people were warning what Gaza was going to turn into. Well, Gaza turned into that. And now we're paying the price of removing our military and our civilians from the Gaza Strip, where we would have been able to prevent this buildup of Hamas in that territory. The giving of our natural gas recently over to Lebanon, which is essentially controlled by Hezbollah. The pullout in 2006, from southern Lebanon, allowing UNIFIL to go in there. All these bad mistakes now are coming back to haunt us. And we're paying for that. And I think that
I would add to that, even the mistake of allowing Israel to become somewhat dependent on American aid.
Sure.
A disaster.
Right. Also, the trading of 1,000 terrorists, including Yahya Sinwar for Gilad Shalit, who was kidnapped and taken hostage inside Gaza. And so when you return 1,000 terrorists for one hostage, basically
you're asking for hostage taking.
So, all these mistakes are coming back to roost now. And I want to take this back a little bit to America, because I thought that's where we probably spend most of the time in this conversation. American Jews today, I think maybe for the first time in many years, really feel Jewish now all of a sudden because people are reminding them that being Jewish is not exactly the same as being American and not
anything
Jewish.
else. Yes.
Right. We're seeing a dramatic rise now in all forms of anti-Semitism. It's rampant on social media, anti-Israel bias in the mainstream media, but there's been violent shootings, attacks on the street in major cities. You know, somebody died at a pro-Palestinian rally in Los Angeles back in November when they were hit in the head, or they fell and they smacked their head and were killed basically. And we're seeing it from almost all sides. And there's always been an argument among different groups or parties in the U.S. about where does the anti-Semitism come from. You know, so I had a conversation here the other day where we were talking about how, yes, there always has been some level of latent anti-Semitism on the right, but today we're seeing the rise of anti-Semitism on the left and how it's also encroaching into some of the institutions of the United States, which is certainly happening. But you're also seeing a rise on the right as well. You know, so how do you want to break this down?
Well, it's a lot to unpack. So the anti-Semitism on the left, which is extreme, Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi, late chief rabbi of the UK, had a very good short formulation for when anti-Semitism becomes dangerous to a civilization, not just to Jews, but to a civilization. 3 stages. Number 1, it moves from the fringes to the mainstream of a political party.
Right.
Number 2, that political party sees it's not harmed by mainstreaming anti-Semitism. And number 3, where those who object are vilified. So all those have been happening in America on the Democrat side for years. It was back in 2006, the Republicans actually asked me to write a memo where I see the future going. And I predicted the rise of the creation of J Street, which is to say that because the Democrats had now, their policies were so clearly anti-Israel, but they just needed to be recast as progressive, so they created J Street. And that happened.
Which was a progressive Jewish organization, which essentially was challenging the more mainstream AIPAC for basically saying that that Israeli policies were wrong, but from a Jewish platform.
Except that it's actually not. In other words, it masquerades as a Jewish organization. It's actually just, it's actual Democrat operatives who are fronting as though they're Jewish. I mean, now, whether they are technically Jewish or not, we see a bunch of these organizations now because this just keeps on lurching further and further extreme. So you have If Not Now and groups like that.
Well, those are
claim to be Jewish, but
if not now, I think most people will identify that's in the fringe. Somehow or another, J Street's managed to have a staying power and influence to the extent that people don't consider them to be that far on the fringes of the conversation.
What you're talking about is a process of just a few years, meaning when they first launched, they were completely anathema. And when they tried, they fit all the definitions or requirements rather to be on the Conference of Presidents. Conference of Presidents said, no, you're anti-Jewish. Right now, they're considered more mainstream.
Because the Obama administration really gave them a lot of access.
Well, exactly right. And, Joe Biden is the first president who actually had an endorsement from J Street. Meanwhile, I believe we stand on the brink of the same thing happening on the right, and that terrifies me. It's hard enough for Jews and Israel to survive within America that looks like the Squad, okay, or takes its leadership from that. If you have people on the right managing to move, and there's a common, in America, people commonly mock, they say liberal, so-called liberal, because there's nothing liberal about progressive values. They're completely authoritarian and intolerant and fascist and all about identity. But the same thing is beginning to happen on the right. And that's a great concern, meaning the latent anti-Semitism, you called it, has always existed everywhere. But as Rabbi Sacks explained, it's when it moves from the fringes to become normalized. So far, the Democrats have just embraced it. The Republicans have held it back. In fact, I can think of 2, at least maybe a third case where they actually said, this person running on a Republican line for office, we can't stop them legally, but do not support them, do not vote for them. The Democrats have never done that. And that's specifically because they were anti-Semites or said that things were anti-Semitic. My concern is that, first of all, what people don't recognize is that Israel and the Jews have never fully understood the Christian support and where it comes from. And it's very complicated. It's way too long for this. They didn't see it coming. They didn't really understand it. And they also don't realize that, by and large, the pro-Christian groups, which I think, quote, evangelical, unquote, even though it's broader than that, more diverse, Under 30 years old, they're not pro-Israel. Under 30 years old, 70% are pro-Palestine. That is a crisis.
And in part because they're also less religious than their parents, right?
That's interesting. Partially that. Partially, I was involved as the only Jew in a meeting of 15 or so Christian university deans and presidents years ago, maybe a decade ago or more, worried about why the incoming students were less philo-Semitic and more anti-Israel. And their theory had to do with the way they taught eschatology, end of days. And I said, that wouldn't explain why young Jews. I said, I think it's simple. We all grew up pre-Oslo. They all grew up in a world narrative that said that the Israelis aren't indigenous, but they're occupiers. And all the Arabs had to do was just hunker down and just be obstinate and not really negotiate. And that forced the world to keep on challenging Israel more and more until Israel became a pariah. Israel became illegitimate. And now Israel trying to defend itself, they're being called genocidal.
Right. It's interesting in the Republican Party, the trend that you're talking about, because it wasn't that long ago that it seemed like the Republican Party was actually moving towards Israel. If you go back, just a couple presidents here, you go back to George Bush Sr., for example, he wasn't pro-Israel. The Republican Party at that time wasn't, overly pro-Israel, but it seems as though you have a lot of Republican politicians who understand that the pro-Israel, that the Christian community in America is pro-Israel, and that they score political points by being pro-Israel. You talked a little.
So, whereas I'd say this point, Alex, at this point, I would tell you the mainstream of the GOP is hardcore pro-Israel, and
right.
You will see, if there had been big primary debates, you saw when there was any discussion, the candidates started raising Israel on their own. Okay. And in fact, some of the elements of the anti-Semitic right, I remember famously Ann Coulter in 2016,
right,
used vulgarity I'm not going to use, and how many Jews they think there are. The answer is they're not doing this for the Jews. They're doing this because Americans of all religions overwhelmingly support Israel.
Right. You talked about 2016, in the Republican Party platform and support for a united Jerusalem. How did that come about?
So in 2011, actually, I met with a state legislator here in Israel, in Jerusalem. He wanted to help. I figured, how can a state legislator help? And then I discovered that he's actually, his name is Alan Clemens from South Carolina.
Sure,
Alan. And he, how can a state legislator really help on a global scale? And then I found out that he was a delegate and that he could be on the platform committee. And so we started working together on a new platform. Now, it was never going to pass in 2012 for a more complicated set of reasons, which is that American Jewry, especially AIPAC in particular, they keep on pushing this idea that Israel is a bipartisan issue. Israel has been one of the most partisan issues in Washington for at least 35 years. They measure the differences between parties on issues, and we could show the graphs. Israel is one of the most partisan issues. What's not so partisan is foreign aid, because if you believe it helps Israel, you're going to give it. And if you're a Democrat, the reason you write money isn't to help; it's to control. And we see it now. Now they're giving the money, and now they're actually controlling Israel in a brutal way. So it has not been to Israel's advantage. But so AIPAC likes this idea that it's bipartisan. No, it's not. It's very partisan. So we decided to, and at that point, the Democrats had removed language about undivided Jerusalem, which had been there for decades. And so AIPAC actually went to the RNC and persuaded them that this is what Israel wanted. Israel wanted to remove this language because Israel wants a two-state solution. That's just a lie. It's not true. At that point, the two-state solution was not something Israel was pushing for. And certainly in 2016, when we brought this forward, so they brought it, and the AIPAC and elements in Romney's campaign basically killed it. In 2016, we brought it forward again. This time it was Donald Trump's campaign. And they just grabbed it. And at that point, and people had seen the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans by then. Famously, they were burning... They said there were more Palestinian flags than American flags at the Democratic convention, and they were burning Israeli flags. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it was very open and obvious, as opposed to the Republicans.
And we're probably likely to see that this year, and 100 times over.
Yeah. Meanwhile, I would say, so what I'm talking about is it's so if snapshot right now, Democrats have gone basically all in with a little bit of pro-Israel rhetoric, but their activities are very harmful. The Republicans are extremely pro-Israel by and large, but now there are fringe elements that are getting louder and louder over the last couple of years. Right. And even after October 7th, that's the concern, because some of them
Right.
very powerful.
You might have expected that maybe if things were sliding that way come October 7th, that you would get a realignment.
Right.
But it's maybe in some ways the opposite. Maybe, I don't know if that's because they're more libertarian, so to speak, on the fringes. And
So there's a rise, what I think of as, people talk about Judeo-Christian, and a lot of Jews don't love the phrase, but the truth is there is Jewish, there is Christian, and there is Judeo-Christian. There's something else that I think these people stand for, and I read a lot of their literature because they keep on emailing it to me, and they keep on talking about this white nationalist Christianity, and they're claiming it's patriotic, but it's not. From my perspective, it's actually it's a throwback to the pagan Christianity, which was what old Europe was, which precisely was so miserable, and so the internecine warfares of two armies claiming to be fighting in the name of Jesus and killing each other was exactly what America was supposed to be the antidote. America, the Pilgrims through the Founding Fathers came over here with a different idea, and they consciously developed in America. Actually, I said this often that Israel's the greatest nation devised by God or created by God, but America's the greatest nation devised and created by man. And because they took the Bible, they did this intentionally to create an idea of human life matters, tolerance matters, people should be able to have a freedom of conscience, a freedom of choice. That's exactly what our Constitution does. And first, so they came running as religious refugees from old Europe. The elements I'm seeing now on the right want to bring that old Europe pagan Christianity to replace Judeo-Christianity, and it's very frightening.
And yeah, so we're definitely starting to see whether it's the Candace Owens, some people are Tucker Carlson, and others coming forward and saying, hey, why are we supporting Israel? It's just causing a lot of trouble for us. And not just Israel, by the way, other countries also, Ukraine, they lump Israel together with Ukraine.
It's worse. They're even claiming that the only reason they're blaming America for fighting Hitler. There's even out there, they're saying it's some overt.
That's a different level, right?
But the people you mentioned, Tucker and Candace Candace more so, Tucker's gotten there sort of saying that it was wrong for America to drop the bomb, which is like a step towards saying, and we all know the bomb was Jewish scientists. In other words, they're trying to suggest that America should have been fine with Hitler. And we're getting closer and closer to that. And here's the thing, they haven't yet been repudiated. That's the concern. I hope and I believe that the right, not just the Republicans as a party, but that Christians in America who are Judeo-Christian will reject them. But it is very frightening, and we're in a moment now where it is dire. Not just obviously, it's the collapse of American civilization. The thing is, the Jews won't be around to see it because first it's the Jews, and then it's the rest of civilization.
And in many ways, we talk about this sometimes between us that the Jewish communal leadership in America, just did not see a lot of these trends coming and did not prepare for it. Did not prepare their communities for it, and have been caught flat-footed, through the rise of anti-Semitism. In many respects, you could have looked at Israel and said, okay, if this whole intersectionality and all this stuff is coming into the vernacular, so Israel could be the model for intersectionality, and yet somehow the American Jewish leaders allowed Israel to get played out of that narrative, to get played onto the wrong side of that narrative, and that the American Jewish leadership, has really, they stood behind their partnerships with Democratic leaders, only to see now how Democrats are pulling away from them, and how they invested so much time into Black American communities, and to see that now, and they marched with them during Black Lives Matter, but now to see post October 7th that those communities are not marching with Jews. So what's been going on? What are the trends in the American Jewish leadership that have led us to this point?
I'll give you. So again, I'm going to come from the perspective. I worked on Capitol Hill, as you said, and at the time, I was the only guy wearing a yarmulke on Capitol Hill. In fact, I think since I've been there, only 2 or 3 have. It's very unusual for people in the Orthodox community, other than to do internships, to work there professionally. So my first year there, all of a sudden, shortly after I got there, people started talking about Jew Day. I knew what Jew Day meant. It meant, well, like AIPAC and these groups come up to Capitol Hill, and it's a mockery because what all these organizations, and even the ones that are the most well-meaning and the most idealistic, at the end of the day, individuals might be idealistic, but complex organizations, whether they're political or business or in between, will always default to their incentives. And the incentives for all these organizations in the end is to continue. They raise ridiculous amounts of money. And, when Elon Omer said it's all about the Benjamins, that's not why America supports Israel. But the argument that it's about Jewish money that is AIPAC's brand argument. That's what they say about themselves, that the reason Congress supports is because of the money we distribute indirectly. That's a horrible lie, and it doesn't help anybody. And when Elon Omer says it, it's anti-Semitic, but the truth is, they teed this up. The truth is, everything that people think about politics is the art, as is news media, by the way, I think, I'm not talking about JNS, of giving people the narrative you want to give them. It's not about conveying a truth. It's about a narrative, and it's very selective. And politics in particular is about controlling people's behavior by giving them a set of ideas. And so people have very strong opinions about politics gleaned from the news that they consume. They know, not only don't they know, the truth is they're being generally misled, right? And so the everything that people think of politics, it's not politics. That's the concession stand around the NBA game, right? The people playing the NBA game are essentially making money off that, possibly, using that, which is why they let them up on Capitol Hill. But there's never been, I'm pretty confident in history, a member of Congress in the House or the Senate who's ever been persuaded by one of these so-called lobbying meetings to change a position. It just doesn't work that way. So that's on the Israel side. On the anti-Semitism side, we've had an even deeper and bigger problem. So therefore, what they're doing is they're making a couple $100 million a year over at AIPAC, right? And the way you do it is by who's giving them the money. Well, we have to give a narrative that makes them happy. So because most Jews, for reasons having nothing to do with Israel, have veered left and Democrat, we have to claim bipartisan, and we have to support this, and we're saying it's all pro-Israel. Comes J Street and says, well, if that's pro-Israel and this is pro-Israel, we'll choose this and focus on this. The worst situation they have was the preeminent brand in fighting anti-Semitism, which is the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. It's not just that they've been complacent. They've been clearly complicit for years now in a really truly anti-Semitic agenda. I mean, they're focused their attention on diverting from the anti-Semitism that has become rampant in the left. And I would say that it was bad even before the new leader Greenblatt came on, who was really, is an actual very aggressive operative for Obama. And
right.
He was placed.
He was in the Obama White House.
Right, exactly. And so there was a move during those years to launch a bunch of organizations pretending to be Jewish and to take over existing organizations. For example, they took over something called the Anne Frank Center, I forget exactly, for Tolerance. And a few years later, they admitted, yeah, we're not really about fighting anti-Semitism or about the Holocaust. It's just to push in a progressive agenda.
Well, Hias, for example, what used to be the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which recently dropped the H in the last several years.
And Jewish Daily Forward dropped Jewish because they said it was too exclusive. It's all these groups. So these are the assimilationist groups that are basically, they want to throw off the yoke of being Jews and think they'll be accepted.
Well, let's talk about the ADL, though, for a second. Anti-Defamation League, their purpose is to really to call out anti-Semitism and to bring attention to it to the extent that then governments and others can work on solutions. But you're saying that they have a different agenda. What is the agenda?
Well, for years, even under Abe Foxman, I don't think their position about Christians and conservatives, I think, was the wrong position overall. But once Greenblatt took over, they become actually tremendously hostile. You talked about how they were marching with BLM. It's not just that we learned after October 7th that BLM said that Israel's genocidal. They said that from their founding. From their founding, they were
we saw Linda Sarsour marching at the front of the BLM movement.
That's right. And ADL so spent its time for years diverting attention away from that, pretending that wasn't the problem, pretending the problem was on the right, pretending that and fueling this idea that white supremacists, bad. Neo-Nazis, bad. But you can see today, they're not the people pouring out in the streets calling for genocide of the Jews. They're not the people who control the universities, who are not just the students, and not just allowing the students, but we at ACLJ, we represent a number of faculty members and students who are bringing suits against and claims in the government against these universities. I mean, it is a genuine hotbed of devoted anti-Semitic genocidal ideas. And the ADL was fine with all of that. No, that's not the problem. The problem is the white supremacists. Well, yeah, white supremacists are a problem, but the proximate, truly deadly issue for Jews now in culture was coming from the left, and they were diverting attention nonstop. And, we have to call it out on all sides. It doesn't make a difference what color the skin is of the anti-Semite. It doesn't matter what party they vote for, what religion they are. there's a definition of anti-Semitism, the IRA definition, International Holocaust Remembrance Association. People should look it up. It's an excellent definition. It was accepted by the Obama administration and put into law, and by the Trump administration and put into law. It was accepted by the UN, accepted by Israel. It's great. Jeremy Corbyn tried to change it. It was that moment, if you look, that the Jews said, that's it.
He was the head of the Labour Party in the UK.
Party in the UK. And he tried to change it to say, it talks about using criticism of Israel, like making believe that's what you're doing when you're actually doing is trafficking in anti-Semitism. There are Democrats who are trying to change it the same way, but now there are Jewish groups or so-called Jewish groups, created, who are trying to push this idea. And the ADL, is not only is it not stopping them, but there are these other alternative definitions that allow for treating Israel differently to treat everyone else and double standards, et cetera. ADL is not fighting for that. ADL, there was supposed to be a massive rally called No Fear. ADL was involved in a couple of years ago. Maybe a few hundred people showed up. That's it, on the mall. And they put up their own definition of anti-Semitism. And of course, they had to include in that, and we're against Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. It was like, you know what? Here's a very interesting story, which I will say publicly for the first time, if I can. Okay. During the Trump years, I got a call from someone who was a political appointee at the Department of Justice. And frantic, where are you? Why aren't you here? I said, why am I supposed to be? I didn't know I was supposed to be there. Well, there's a 2-day summit against hate in America. And they listed everything: Islamophobia, anti-immigrant, racism, the whole list of everybody, misogyny, anti-LGBT, except for anti-Semitism, the one hatred that they wouldn't even mention. So this Trump political went over to the organizers and said, what about anti-Semitism? And they said, oh, Jews aren't a minority. Jews aren't a minority. And then he said, well, what do you mean? Jews are not only a minority, but our statistics, the FBI statistics, show that more hate crimes against Jews, not just proportionally, but by the actual absolute numbers than any other group. To which he said, and when I say he, one of the organizers, this is a guy from ADL's Washington office, who's the one who said Jews aren't a minority, said, yeah, well, Jews get along with the police. And therefore, we don't think that anti-Semitism is a problem, so we're not going to address it here at the Department of Justice.
ADL.
That's the ADL National.
Yeah.
That's outrageous.
Now, you've been involved in getting some anti-BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions acts passed in the United States. And you mentioned before Alan Clemens.
Yes.
He was the first one in South Carolina really to advance anti-BDS law on the state level. Tell me a little bit about your involvement in that and what else can be done to combat the tide of rising anti-Semitism.
Sure, great questions. So let's bifurcate those answers. In terms of the legislative work, there's a small group of people, just like a little SWAT team we call ourselves, just 3 or 4 people who aren't doing this officially for any organizations, who started the first anti-BDS laws at the state level, because we just been working a lot at the state level. And there's a national organization called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's a couple of thousand conservative, mostly but not entirely Republican, state legislators. And I used to go there for clients when I was off the Hill. And so I was known. And again, the only yarmulke, and people used to run to me. They became state legislators because the Christian Coalition had encouraged them, and they were very strongly Christian and very devout, and they wanted policy, and they were very, very upset about certain policies. And so we started working with them, separate and apart from my client work, on pro-Israel policies. When Alan Clemens, when I met him later, it turns out he is a very powerful at ALEC. He was like the leader of ALEC at some point, and very well networked. And therefore, he was able to bring a bunch of fantastic pieces of legislation, which Israel, actually, I remember I was at a conference, they didn't understand. They thought it was viral. It's like, no, it's a very clear roadmap. Anti-BDS, what the states can do about it, completely legitimate, completely constitutional. Then certain other anti-Semitism measures, and then now to try and keep the IRA definition as the relevant definition, and ultimately we also did the platform. This group of people. So that's one thing. The state level has been wonderful in terms of because most states are still dominated by the right and by normal people in the middle. It hasn't gone completely woke left. Separately, I'll say on the communications and what to do to combat anti-Semitism. So one thing, at ACLJ, again, it's primarily a Christian organization. I mean, obviously I'm Jewish, and there are some other Jews who work there, but it is primarily Christian. And its audience, it has a daily show, and it reaches millions directly through social media.
How do people see that, by the way?
It's available online. There's a show called Seculo, and you could go to ACLJ's website, aclj.org, to find it. And it's a daily show from I think of Eastern time because that's where I'm from noon to 1. And God bless, the ACLJ, because It has millions of followers. It's mostly known as a law firm because it does pro bono legal work. And not only do we support Christian causes, but, we fought for yeshivas with zoning laws that were obviously anti-Semitic. Tenants were told to take down their mezuzahs. So it's fights for, and it always cares about this. And again, helping the state of Israel. And recognizing, as they do, that there's a trend, even in the Christian world, to become less supportive, regularly, daily. And by the way, so I'm senior counsel there. Another one of our senior counsels, Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State. Rick Grinnell, super pro-Israel, former acting national security correct, and also director of national security, and also ambassador to Germany. And I don't know if you remember this, he's not Jewish, but when there's a huge surge of anti-Semitism in Germany, he said, some minister said to the Jews not to wear yarmulkes. He said, no, wear them. And he put on a yarmulke. He's not a Jew, he put on a yarmulke. And I know this. People said, well, he's got security. They fought him on this, the Secret Service, and they forced him to wear bulletproof. He endangered his life to wear a yarmulke. So people like that, who are Christians, who have stood up for Israel, and ACLJ is pumping out that message. I think it's more important than ever. And I know, and I hope and I believe, and I know your audience is largely Christian as well. I don't know what percentage it is, but the more people who see the kind of news that you portray, which is accurate and true and tells the truth, we need that, because the mainstream media, just like academia, is really in the hands of the woke. And the messages they give are they're not only terrible, they're just not true.
Well, Jeff Ballabon, we covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much for being with us here in Jerusalem.
A pleasure. Looking continued success to JNS. I love the work you do, and hope we'll do this again.
Thanks so much.